now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Marzia Mortati from Politecnico di Milano. Welcome, Marzia. The Zoom room is yours. Okay, let's see. There we have.
Am I back? Do you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Perfect. Sorry, sometimes here at Polyme we have Wi-Fi issues, but hopefully it will support us throughout this hour together in this discussion. And you should also see my slides now. Do you confirm?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. So we are all set to start. And first of all, again, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and have this chance to share with you this afternoon some of my recent research reflections. So today, I would like to reflect with you on a topic that has been at the center of my research over the past few years, which is specifically how design is expanding beyond its traditional domains, and what this expansion implies for design, both as a discipline and as a profession. But also for this talk, I have decided to center my discussion around design's expanding orders because I believe that this is also a topic that should be a central reflection for design researchers in any field right now, given also the current socioeconomic and political disruptions that we are lately going through. However, before I start, let me just briefly say something about myself. Let me just briefly introduce a bit about who I am and where I'm coming from, and also why the topic I've chosen for today's intervention is exactly this one. So first of all, I'm a design researcher, of course, and if I had to describe the evolution of my research interests, I would say that they are mostly characterized by tensions, a bit as you see in this slide. One of these tensions is that I have gradually moved along my research career from studying design primarily in the private sector. Mostly my PhD was focused on that. It was focused on small and medium and micro enterprises, to working much more closely with the public sector. Other similar tensions I have experienced are linked to design primarily operating in an analogic way. In fact, when I was a design student myself, I was following courses that did not allow us as students to use software to produce any type of output for our exams. To design nowadays being mainly concerned with using digital tools and also producing digital outputs, in fact. So these tensions have exposed me to very different contexts in which design operates, from products and services to more contemporarily to policies, systems, and institutional processes. And right now, I believe all of these objects of design are present in my reflections, in particular because I'm very passionate about trying to understand the broader trajectories according to which design is evolving, which is exactly what I will try to reflect on together with you today in this speech. So building on this very brief experience I told you about, and over roughly 20 years of being a design researcher myself, I've had the opportunity to observe, and in some cases also experience directly, a number of important shifts in what design is concerned with. And because I've always seen design applied to so many different kinds of objects, I have also always been interested in a more fundamental question, which is the following: what is the essence of design? And what is it that remains constant, even as design moves across different domains? So this question became particularly important for me when I started working in more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary environments. As a designer, I have worked with engineers, with policymakers, with social scientists, and often in these contexts and in these situations, I have felt that one of my roles in these projects, in these complex projects, was to explain a bit what was distinctive about design, so what I was bringing to the table as compared to other disciplines and professions. So not just what design does, but actually what kind of knowledge design produces and how design can contribute differently, can bring a value that is specific of its own. And this has been a bit, I would say, an underlying question throughout my research that is underpinning a lot of the research projects that I still do nowadays. And it is also what I will try and share with you today, linking to some of my recent reflections on this general idea of distinctiveness in design. And in particular, I would like and try to reflect on how this distinctiveness today is challenged, and perhaps because of these challenges need to be refined in light of the transformations that design is currently undergoing. So building on this, I want to start my speech with a question. If design is now concerned with so many different types of outputs, from objects to services, systems, policies, and more for sure, what exactly is it that uniquely distinguishes design and determines its core value? And of course, how this is evolving from the past. Indeed, today, design is involved in developing many different objects. Artificial intelligence systems is definitely one on which I'm placing a lot of attention lately, but also public policy. It is engaged in supporting climate transitions. It is engaged in inquiring and trying to help steer organizational change. And this shows that design is now operating in domains that until recently were not considered design at all, we could say. And yet, if we ask what design specifically contributes to these contexts and these domains, the answer that I find around talking also with colleagues and fellow researchers is often vague. Hence, my opening question for this lecture. So to ground a little bit this discussion and unpack this opening question a bit more together with you, let me briefly go through 3 exemplar areas where I believe design is currently expanding, touching upon them very, very lightly, so with no aim of being exhaustive on all of this debate. The first example is public policy. So over the past decade or so, or a bit more, we have seen a growing convergence between design and policymaking. In fact, several scholars, including myself, have been concerned with trying to explain this connection and building a case for why public policy can be considered an object of design. In this area, reading academic literature, but also other types of gray literature, design is increasingly presented in a few main ways. As a way to make policy more participatory by creating, for instance, better conditions for people to engage with public administrations, as a way to make policy more tangible, for instance, by translating policy options into prototypes that people can play with and understand implications of more deeply, or is presented as a way to make policy more experimental, for instance, by offering ways to trial policies at a small scale before deployment on a larger scale, or, for instance, on an entire population. There is, we can say today, a substantial body of literature, in particular coming from design research, that promotes this idea of using design approaches to address complex societal and policy challenges. And this is shown also in recent tracks in academic conferences. For instance, the upcoming Design Research Society conference has a dedicated track that I'm also co-chairing that has been going on for the past 3 editions of these as one of the most important academic conferences for design research. So definitely we can say that this is an area of research that is attracting increasing attention. So much so that policy is starting to be understood mainly by design researchers as an object of design. And in this space, if we were to generalize, we may say that design can operate at a micro scale, for instance, working on services that are developed and implemented around policy, at a meso scale, for instance, developing interactions with public institutions, but also at a macro scale, so working even on the processes through which policies may be developed. However, in this discourse, there is also an interesting asymmetry, which I would like to underline. While on the one hand, we see design scholars and practitioners being very interested in engaging with policy as an object of their work, policy design as a field, as a discipline, has so far made a lot less reference to design studies. And so we have a situation where design is trying to engage with policymaking, but its specific contributions is not always clearly recognized, or if we refer more to research jargon, articulated or theorized. The second example instead refers to artificial intelligence, which is a context that I've grown increasingly interested in the past 6 years. So in this context, there is a growing body of scholarly research, especially if we look at the HCI community, describing design as involved in activities like shaping interfaces to make AI systems understandable and usable by people, or also structuring user interactions with AI systems, and even making these interactions more pleasurable, so much so that more recent discourses around UX design are starting to inquire the development of the so-called delighters, or ways in which these systems can be made more appealing and more engaging for people, or also focusing on developing intelligent adaptive user interfaces that are capable of accounting for real-time modifications that AI can make to improve the user experience once again. But also here, if we look more closely, this is only the tip of the iceberg, because the more traditional types of intervention the design makes in this system are not enough to describe the full picture of the interventions the design can have when it comes to helping shape artificial intelligence systems. In fact, in AI systems, designers are not only shaping outputs. In fact, according to other strands of research, designers are also looking into changing their role when engaged with AI systems to start and understand how they can shape different types of things. For instance, feedback loops, which are cycles fed by human actions and translate human digital traces into data that in turn feed algorithms, or also shaping learning processes built again on the digital traces of humans and that humans leave behind when moving in the digital environment. And more importantly, I would argue designers are creating decision-making structures according to which behaviors are shaped within these AI systems. For instance, design is starting to be involved in selecting and curating data, so to instruct machines on how to model complex social phenomena, which is a much more interesting research perspective with many ethical implications involved in it. And building on these, for instance, we could say that the way data is selected or labeled for an AI system directly influences how an algorithm behaves. And the way an interface presents options influences, in turn, how users interact with the system, thus shaping behavior and determining specific governance rules according to which then humans act within these systems. This means in particular that design is not just a layer on top of something that expert technicians have built or are building, but an activity that can be engaged in profoundly shaping how the system itself operates and is conceptualized. And I have myself focused particularly on this perspective when inquiring the relationship between AI and AI, design and AI systems, trying to understand AI exactly from the perspective of design and service research, or also service innovation. Publishing also recently one of my examinations, that is the one that you see mentioned in this slide, that has led me to develop a definition for what service AI represents and how this influences service designing in particular. This definition particularly points at the fact that AI is a different type of technology because when embedded in services, it has agency. And agency here for me is a very important keyword, which means that is a technology that has capability to act. And it's a capability of acting that is substantially different from the capability that humans have to act. And because of this, it also needs to be treated and incorporated into a design project very differently. However, also in this case, as in the previous case, in many avenues where AI systems are discussed and developed, the contribution of design is not always required or understood. And finally, a third example, which actually relates to climate transitions. Here, design is increasingly referred to and called upon to work with complex systems. These are complex of several different reasons, but also because they involve multiple stakeholders, long time frames, conflicting interests, deep uncertainty, and many other characteristics. Therefore, in this context, design is often discussed and expected to, for instance, facilitate participation, support decision-making, enable new forms of collaboration, or even enable the emergence of new forms of business, for instance, in connection to the idea of social innovation. And this ethos is reflected in several large-scale initiatives, including, for instance, at the European level, the New European Bauhaus or various urban transition programs and projects that are receiving increasing amount of funding from the European Commission itself. And again, here design seems to be positioned as a key actor in helping address major societal challenges that are multi-level and require systemic responses where traditional approaches have shown limits. But its contribution is often misunderstood or simply not clearly articulated. Oops. So if we reflect on these three examples that I have briefly gone through with you, public policy, AI systems, and climate transitions, I believe we can start seeing a clear pattern emerging. On the one hand, the design is no longer confined to more traditional type of outputs like objects or interfaces. It has already started to operate within systems, within infrastructures, within societal processes at large, engaging in an expansion that is not marginal, but rather central to how design is being discussed and practiced today. But on the other hand, and at the same time, and this is where my starting question comes back, this expansion is also raising many new questions for design. In particular, if design is now involved in all of these domains, what exactly is its contribution? What does design do in this context that is not already done by other disciplines or professions? Or what does it do that is different and distinctive? And more importantly, how can we articulate this in a way that is not just rhetorical, but grounded in a clear understanding of design as a form of knowledge and a form of knowledge production? So these questions bring me to the first act, what I have called act in this presentation, that I have titled as expansion, or what design has become. If we look at the trajectory of design over the years, of course, simplifying to a great degree, and as described by scholars already, one of the most influential being certainly Richard Buchanan, we can see a clear expansion from symbols and communication to products and environments to interactions and services to systems and organizations. And today, increasingly more towards policies, AI systems, infrastructures, and even futures and hope, which is becoming one of the most interesting topics in current design research. This tells us that this expansion is not just about adding new domains and making the list of design interests longer. It is about a constant and ongoing transformation in the scope and nature of design. So if we look at design historically, we can depict a relatively clear progression. Design initially focused on communication, so for instance, developing symbols, images, visual language. Then it moved towards the construction of products, including physical artifacts, objects, environments. Later, the focus also shifted to include interactions, for instance, services, experiences, user journeys, and then to integration, what we can call integration, looking at systems, organizations, even ecosystems. What is also important here, though, is that each step did not replace the previous one, but it expanded it, keeping the old focus and complementing it with something else. Which means that design did not stop designing objects when it started designing services. It just added new layers of complexity and expanded its list of interests. And as the most recent step, we're also seeing that design is becoming increasingly concerned with new elements, new items that we mentioned, for instance, policies, data, AI systems, and so on. And I would argue that these are not just more complex objects, and this is where the interesting shift is for me happening today, but they are fundamentally different kinds of objects, especially because they are not, like in the past, fixed and static entities that can be developed looking at a single particular frame in time, but they are essentially dynamic and keep evolving over time, and very often they even evolve beyond the control of the designer. And here is where the very epistemology of design, we can say, is starting to change. So on the one hand, this expansion tells us that design today operates across a very wide spectrum of objects or types of outputs of its activities. On the other, it tells us that this is not just a matter of scale, but it's also a matter of responsibility, because as we move from designing fixed and near perfect artifacts like we were used to do in the past, to designing systems that evolve by themselves, and sometimes, if allowed, may make also decisions for us, for people in general, the consequences of design, and in particular of design decisions, become very, very different. They become more distributed, they become more long-term, and overall, above all, they become more difficult to be predicted and to be pinned down. Ultimately, who, in fact, can fully foresee the consequences of implementing a certain policy? Or who can fully foresee the effects of deploying a new AI system in the society? And because of these expanding interests and responsibilities, design is increasingly expected to do different things, for instance, bridging technology, society, and ethics. This means that essentially design is asked to do very complex things, for instance, translating complex technologies into meaningful experiences, mediating between different viewpoints, languages, cultures, interests, positionalities, while also helping address societal challenges. But here is where the tension I mentioned earlier emerges again. Despite this expansion and these expectations, design is still often positioned as something that comes at the end of a process, something that makes things usable or attractive, or something that facilitates participation. In other words, it often remains marginal or instrumental in processes of innovation and transformation that would require a much deeper approach. So, to articulate further on this point, let me now move to a concrete example around this, drawn from my own research practice. For the past 6 years, I have been collaborating closely with AI engineers. Together with these engineers, we have been working on developing shared approaches to train public officials in adopting more human-centric forms of AI to innovate public services. And one of the key challenges in this collaboration for me has been a very simple one, but also a very fundamental one. We did not speak the same language, basically. We were operating with different concepts, with different priorities, and fundamentally, we had very different ways of structuring and understanding problems. So, one of our main efforts over these years has been to understand how our two approaches could be integrated in a way that would meaningfully embed human values into AI systems conceptualization and then development. Building on this experience and preparing for this lecture, I have decided to take a step back and actually ask AI directly what it thought about design being increasingly expected to bridge technology, society, and ethics, and whether the AI itself thought that this was actually true, in particular when design was engaged in shaping AI systems. And the answer I received is the one that you see on the screen, and it's actually very clear. I identified three main areas to articulate the contribution of design in this space, in particular related to design, helping define the problem, frame user needs, helping shaping the interaction and the experience of the system for the people, and also helping ensure fairness, transparency, and accountability for these systems. So then I also asked the AI to give me a real world example where this actually happened, because I was a bit skeptical with the reply that it had given to me, in particular with reference to the area of ethics and responsibility that the AI itself had pointed out. And again, the algorithm gave me back a very clear example, the example of Amazon. So in this case, in Amazon's case, an AI system was used to support recruitment processes. However, because the system was trained on historical data, it ended up reproducing existing biases in this data, in particular gender biases. So what the model did was to systematically penalize CVs that contained signals associated with women simply because past hiring practices had been biased against women for that same position. And this is a very clear example of how AI systems are not neutral, of course, but inherit and amplify patterns that already exist in the data that it received and on which it is trained. So, to address this critical situation, the AI continued in its reply, proposing to me a design solution which was found. What we would call the human in the loop approach, expressing the idea that essentially human judgment should always remain critical to a decision-making process. So I suggested that instead of fully automating decisions, transparent processes should be designed that account for constant human oversight. And here the AI said design plays a role by helping to make decision processes more transparent, by developing ways to enable this oversight from humans, and overall supporting human interpretability of any type of AI output. Now, as an audience that is expert in design, I would expect that we would probably all agree with this perfect and polished reply that AI gave back to me. This indeed seems aligned with the role that design should have and that we would like it to have to ensure that AI systems are meaningful for people, include human values, are fair, transparent, and overall are accountable for whatever activity they produce. But we could also add that design in this space will help or should help mitigate biases and thus overall preserve human agency in all of these types of AI-supported decision-making processes. But then, if you stop and think for a moment, do you think that this really happens in practice? Even if this is the perfect scenario that we would all like to be concrete and to be real. And is this role of design actually fully considered in how AI systems are developed? Or is it mostly only articulated in a small subset of best practices? So to move one step further in this discussion, let me now introduce a model that is widely used in data science. This model is called the CRISP-DM, which stands for Cross-Industry Standard Process for Data Mining. It is a model that was introduced in the 90s, and it is still one of the most widely used frameworks to describe how AI systems are developed. What is interesting about this model is that it is entirely centered around data, from understanding the problem, which is actually in the model called business understanding, to preparing data, modeling data, evaluation, deployment. The central concern of the process that is depicted here is having good quality and, of course, enough good quality data to model a situation and consequently instruct an algorithm. Of course, you may think, because this is a model that comes from data science. Now, after years of collaboration with AI engineers trying to align our languages, as I said earlier, and trying to align our approaches, because design processes didn't seem to work for us as a shared framework, we have actually started working together on this type of model here that I mentioned and that you see on the slide, to try and understand where design could concretely be integrated into the process of developing an AI system. And together we have identified 3 key moments according to which design can contribute at the beginning of the process, in framing better the problem around people's lived reality, in the middle of the process, in helping to shape interactions and interpreting AI outputs for people understanding, and at the end of the process, in making these outputs usable and understandable again by people. But also here, if we look more closely at these contributions, I think we can identify at least 2 limitations. At least these are at least 2 limitations that I have identified, and you may identify more. First, these contributions tend to fit design into an existing process that doesn't consider design at all. Therefore, the first limit is in trying to adapt traditional design practices to a framework that is fundamentally driven by data. Hello, is someone trying to speak? No? Okay, sorry. So I was saying the first limit is that this model or this approach is trying to adapt traditional design practices to a framework that is fundamentally driven by data, by mathematical modeling and computation. So design is very instrumentally inserted into the process rather than used to fundamentally transform it and center it around human values as it should be. Second, the positioning or dispositioning does not significantly advance design practice or doesn't help design to learn and move forward. Instead, it often results in what we might call an instrumentalization of design, where design becomes a way to signal that human values are considered, users are involved, ethical aspects are addressed, at least to a certain extent, even if the process remains traditional and there is, of course, no guarantee of a substantial influence on how the final system will in fact operate. In some cases, we may even start talking about a form of design washing, pass me the term, because we know human values should be considered and made central, and therefore design may be simply used to legitimize this rather than to reshape overall the process. And this is instrumentalization, I would argue, is not limited to the role of design in developing AI systems, but we could examine these in different types of fields and spot a similar pattern. For example, in public participation, on the one hand, public institutions are increasingly encouraged to engage more with citizens through co-creation, through participatory activities, and so on. On the other hand, design is often presented as a tool to make participation more inclusive, more creative, more engaging. Of course, I'm generalizing here, but this gives you the idea of my sort of argument. So if we look more closely, design is often not transforming public participation processes in many cases, in many practical and concrete situations, but rather just to improve its appearance. That is, to make it more attractive, more acceptable, to be able to say, we did involve people, we did co-creation, box ticked. So in both cases, AI and public participation design is present, but often not as a transformative approach, but rather in an instrumental way that I'm not sure is the one that we would really like to see. And this brings us back to the tension I mentioned earlier. Design is emerging everywhere to a certain extent, but its role is often unclear or is limited or is reduced to a legitimizing instrument. So for me here, the question is not whether design is present in these processes, because it clearly is. The question is rather whether it is actually shaping these processes, helping transform these processes, or simply adapting to them. And this brings me to the second act of this talk that I have called tensions. So for this speech, I have decided to articulate this part around 3 main claims. which for me, at least, are central tensions I currently see in this expansion of design or in this context that I have described so far, and I would be happy to discuss more with you on them. Claims that are mostly about what design claims for itself, the way it explains its distinctive characteristics, very tied also to design, justifying its expansions to these new objects that I have briefly touched upon earlier. So the first claim is that design solves complex problems. This is something that we hear very often. We've probably all tried to articulate ourselves. And my critique to this claim is that it is certainly widely made, but seldom explained convincingly, and often supported by concepts borrowed from other fields, and not from the design field directly. But here I also want to be very clear. This is not to say at all that design does not engage with complexity. It clearly does. But compared to disciplines such as system thinking or STS, science and technology studies, design has not been equally articulate about how it does this and what is specific about its contribution. So again, the issue is not competence, but articulation. And according to this, I would like to remind to all of us a quote from Donella Meadows that says, "We can't control systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them." While the tradition of design tries to deliver near perfect and finished solutions, which is in stark opposition to this quote from Donella Meadows. So this raises an important question. If complexity cannot be controlled or fully understood, what exactly does it mean to say that design solves complex problems? The second claim is instead that design is participatory. And here again, I see a tension. Participation can be many different things. It can be a method, it can be a rhetoric, it can be a way to try and depoliticize decisions. We have many cases in which participation has just been adopted as something procedural. Not all of them, of course. We also have very successful cases. But if we were to look at the glass half empty, let's say, we also can find many cases in which participation has just been used as a procedural approach, just to mask underlying power dynamics rather than really addressing them. So let me pause here for a moment and give you another concrete example of what I mean in this case with this claim. In 2017, Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Google, proposed to transform part of Toronto's waterfront into a data-driven smart city. At first, the project was presented as a model case of participatory design. There were workshops, public consultations, roundtables, a very extensive engagement program aimed at creating a sense of community ownership, which is something we would all want and go for in our participatory approaches. But very quickly, a number of tensions emerged in the project and in the process. First, participation was deployed as a largely procedural process because citizens were invited to give feedback on design elements like materials chosen, public spaces, types of services provided. But the most critical decisions, for instance, data ownership or civilians infrastructures, these were not put up for discussion, but remained closed, negotiated only between those few that had the real decision-making power. Second, conflict was effectively removed from the process. The project was framed as a neutral technical solution of urban efficiency, aiming at urban efficiency. But for many residents and activists, the real issue was not at all technical. It was a political one because it concerned privacy, it concerned governance, it concerned the privatization of public space. And because these concerns were not properly addressed, participation just became a filter rather than a space for open dialogue and possibly contestation. And third, and perhaps most importantly, the power dynamics were never really shifted throughout the process. At some point, Sidewalk Labs proposed the creation of a data trust to reassure the public, but many critics pointed out that control still remained with those who owned the infrastructure. In this case, a large private corporation. And so participation was there in this example, but without real decision-making power. And as a result, the project was eventually abandoned in 2020. Officially was abandoned for economic reason, but in reality, we may argue that it collapsed because of trust, because of lack of trust. And I think that this is a very clear example of what happens when participation is used instrumentally as a sort of design washing exercise without addressing the real underlying political and economic structures that shape a particular process or situation. The third claim is that design is neutral facilitation. And here I would like to immediately add that, from my perspective, design is never neutral, because designers do many things that are not neutral. For instance, they structure choices, they shape outcomes, they define what becomes visible or invisible, even when they design interfaces for complex AI systems. In digital systems, for example, what we design are not just features, but they are governance mechanisms, they are behavioral regulators, they are even forms of digital law. And so let me give you another brief example to articulate this topic further, but this time using a platform that we all know very well, Uber. Uber is often presented as a service based on a platform that connects drivers and riders through a digital interface with a dedicated algorithm behind. Of course, this is a very simplified type of description that is relevant only for our analysis purposes. However, if we stop and examine more closely what Uber has really designed, it is not just a service or a platform, but rather a system of behavior regulation. Take the rating system, for example. Drivers must maintain a rating above a certain threshold to remain active on the platform. If the rating drops, they risk being deactivated. At the same time, also riders are rated, and their behavior can influence their access to the service overall. So what in the platform looks like feedback is actually a mechanism of control that shapes how drivers and riders must behave, how polite they are, how they interact, even how they manage their time. Another example linked to this is surge pricing logics. According to these, prices increase dynamically based on demand, encouraging drivers to move to specific areas of a city at a specific time. Again, this is not just a feature. It's a way of directing behavior in the real world by means of the system. And then there are cancellation penalties, incentives, algorithmic matching, and so on and so forth. All of these elements together, I would argue, form a set of rules that structure how people act within and around the system, touching very deeply and profoundly the real world around us. So what Uber has designed is not just an algorithm or an interface or even a business. It is a system that governs behavior in the service with direct consequences in the real world. And I think understanding this is extremely important for us as designers today, because it shows that when we design systems, we are not only called upon to solve a problem, but to define how people should behave within those systems and around these systems. And this can never be neutral. So again, the question is not whether design influences behavior. It always has done so, and obviously does so. The question is how consciously and in whose interests. So summing up on these tensions and reconnecting to the previous part of my speech, design has progressively expanded its scope towards becoming concerned with new types of things, including institutional rules, distributed decision-making, social infrastructures, AI-mediated realities. And every time design does so, it also bears greater responsibilities compared to the past. Because every time we as designers draw a line of visibility to design a service, for instance, we decide who is accountable. Every time we automate a task, we redistribute authority. Every time we simplify a social phenomenon for computational modeling, we actually decide where reality gets left out. And this is a great responsibility for us as designers in this space. So this articulation of the tensions of expansion leads me to the third and final act of this talk, which I have called repositioning, or what design could become. Building on everything we discussed so far, it is evident that past frameworks are no longer appropriate, of course. They focused on artifacts, they focused on interactions, they focused on systems. But as we have articulated so far, design today operates also on governance, knowledge, behavior, and many other different types of outputs and objects. So far I have articulated how design is expanding into these new domains, and I have also discussed of the tensions that this expansion is creating. Using this lens to examine some of the most established frameworks for design, for instance, if we were thinking about service design or design thinking or anything else that may come to your mind, we see that they in fact focus on what we see in the left-hand side of the slide. But these are categories that although we've always explained them, we've always used them to explain what design is concerned with, and although for a long time they have worked reasonably well, if we go back to think about the examples I showed to you earlier, we can already immediately see that something does not fully fit. Taking again AI systems, design, as we described it quite briefly, there is not just about creating an interface or improving a user journey. It is about shaping learning processes, shaping how data is selected, shaping how models learn, and ultimately how decisions are made. For example, when we decide what data is included in a data set, is already a design decision. And this defines what the system will in turn be able to see and what will instead be left out of its sight. So this is not just interaction design. It is, let's say, epistemology design for a system, which is a system that essentially evolves and learns. And this means that we are not just designing a system in the traditional sense, but we are designing something that can act and therefore has agency, as we mentioned already. So when we say in this perspective the design is expanding, what we really mean is not just that design is working on more things. So we do not really only mean that design has made the list of its concerns longer, but rather the design is working on different kinds of things altogether, things that often evolve beyond the control of the designer. And because of these, past models, I believe, feel incomplete, because they help us understand where design is coming from, but not very much about where design may be going in the future. And so this is where I would like to introduce my proposal that I published now quite a few years ago about the fifth order of design, not as a fixed category, but actually as a compass to think about how design is evolving and has already evolved to a certain extent. So this fifth order suggests that design is increasingly concerned with how reality is understood and acted upon, essentially implying a shift in the very epistemology of design, from universal to plural, but also from objectification to relationalization. And let me conclude this talk with giving you only two brief exemplar shifts that are not exhaustive, but hopefully meaningful for us to conclude our reflection together. So the first shift is what I have called here design without control, particularly visible in AI systems. In this context, as we described already, outputs of a design process evolve because essentially systems that we create learn. Authorship is distributed between humans and algorithms, and therefore design can no longer be just about producing a final artifact, but should find ways to create systems that continuously adapt and that are released as what I would term good enough for now. So also here, let me give you a brief concrete example of what I mean by this design without control. If we look at a system like Tesla Autopilot, design is no longer in this context just what you see on the dashboard or the interface inside the car. It is an entire architecture designed to learn from human behavior. While you're driving manually, the system is running in the background in what Tesla calls shadow mode. This means that the system is constantly observing what you do and compares what you are doing to what the algorithm would have done in the same situation. So every time you make a decision, for instance, you turn left or right or you brake, the action becomes data. And it becomes a way of telling the system, In this situation, this is what a human would do. In this sense, interaction is no longer just interaction, of course. It becomes a form of training for the algorithm. And the car itself is no longer just a product. It is an infrastructure that continuously collects and processes data. But what is even more interesting is how this system evolves. Because when something unexpected happens, for example, when a driver intervenes abruptly, that moment is recorded and sent back to Tesla. And it is then used to retrain the model. And once the model is updated, the new version is distributed back to all vehicles through software updates. So this means that the design is never fixed. It is constantly evolving based on millions of interactions happening across the entire fleet of Tesla vehicles. And this has very concrete consequences. The behavior of the car changes over time, the interface changes, and even the way risk is calculated can change, for instance, linked to safety scores or insurance adjustments and so on. So this also means that the product you bought at the beginning is not essentially the same product that you are using 1 year after, 2 years after, or even just 1 month after. Thus, what we see here is that the designer is no longer designing a stable object, but a set of feedback loops and an infrastructure of continuous learning and adaptation. And this is what I mean by design without control, that the designer is essentially setting the conditions, but the outcomes emerge over time through data acquisition and in particular, and most importantly, through human interactions. So again, here the question is no longer what we design, but how what we design continuously evolves. And this can be adapted through all of the items in the model of the fifth order, according to which all of the 5 elements should be designed to fully develop a system of this kind, like the example you see on the slide now, from the graphics up to the behavioral logics that we just described in the example of Tesla. And the second shift and final one in what I see happening in design is designing contested systems, such as climate transitions. Here, design operates in contexts that, as we said already, are multi-actor, politically contested, and deeply uncertain. So if the first shift shows us a form of design without control, where systems evolve through data and feedback loops, this second shift brings us into a different kind of complexity, not only a technical complexity, but also social and deeply political complexity. When we look at areas like climate transitions or public governance, design no longer operates within a bounded system. Instead, it operates across networks of actors, and these actors can also take very different forms from one another. For example, we can think of centralized networks where decision-making is concentrated in a single node, or completely decentralized networks where control is distributed but still coordinated, or fully distributed networks where multiple actors interact autonomously and no single entity is fully in control of the process itself. So why does this matter for design? Because each of these configurations produces different possibilities for actions that in turn shape who gets to decide, how coordination happens, and also how resilient the system is going to be in the long run. So design in this context is, again, not just about creating solutions, but about configuring relationships, or it is relational, as I said earlier. And this is where also the idea of designing democratic infrastructures, I believe, becomes important. When I say democratic infrastructures, I mean the spaces, the processes, the tools, and the organizational arrangements that make these collaborations possible over time. So these are certainly not single artifacts. They are ongoing conditions, once again, that allow people to connect, to deliberate, but even to experiment together and finally to act and take their own decisions. So also here, instead of designing a product or a service, designers are, I believe, increasingly involved in shaping these infrastructures. And this is a very different kind of work if we compare it to the past, because it means designing for long-term interactions, for accounting for multiple perspectives, and often, and most importantly, for accounting for conflicting types of interests. And this brings us back to the shift I mentioned earlier. So from moving from problem solving essentially to problem setting. And in this context, the challenge again is not to fix a system that is no longer working, but it is rather to understand how a problem is framed, to recognize whose perspectives are included or excluded, or even to create the conditions where different interpretations can coexist. So design becomes less about delivering solutions and more about enabling processes that should be open, that should be contested and constantly evolving once again, like in the case of the AI systems. And this is where design becomes deeply political, not because it takes a position by itself, but because it structures how positions can emerge. And this is a deep shift, I would argue, that moves design from fixing problems, from optimizing systems, from delivering finished solutions to contextualizing problems, to signifying problems, and to grounding them essentially in human values. So in this perspective, we could also understand design through 5 key roles, which are the key roles on which I'm reflecting more right now. And these are the ones that you see listed in the slide: inspiration, contradiction, amplification, provocation, imagination. So to try and explain what these mean, let me apply them to a final, very brief example, which is urban mobility, and specifically the transition, from private car ownership to micromobility, and what is often called the notion of the 15-minute city. So we see this initiative in many cities nowadays, like in Paris, it has been used a lot, or also in Barcelona's superblocks concept. And these are not just urban design projects. They are attempts to fundamentally reorganize how we live, how we move, how we relate to public space. So in this type of context, the first key role that I would argue for design is inspiration. Here, design helps reveal patterns, for instance, that are otherwise difficult to see. For example, through data visualization, through urban mapping, through producing different types of outputs, design can show, for instance, how much space in our cities is actually allocated to cars. But when you visualize this, that becomes quite a striking topic, because streets that we used to take for granted as normal suddenly appear as spaces dominated by a single function. And this can trigger a shift in perception from thinking that this is just a street to realizing that that is a public space that has been, in fact, allocated to a very specific and perhaps inefficient function. So design here doesn't solve anything. It just reframes how we see the problem. The second role is contradiction. And here is where design could be able to introduce friction, challenging what we consider normal. Again, linked to the 15-minute city, one example could be tactical urbanism. For instance, taking a single parking space and temporarily transforming it into a small public park. This is a very small intervention, but it can be able to create a strong contradiction, because it will be able to place something unexpected in a space where a car is assumed to belong. And in doing so, it would be able to raise questions like, for instance, why is this space reserved for a vehicle rather than for people or for doing other types of activities? So again, also here, design is not solving a problem, but it is rather helping people challenge assumptions. The third role is what I call amplification, where design can make visible what is usually hidden or undervalued. For instance, again, in car-centric systems, we often overlook the benefits of slower forms of mobility, for instance, walking, cycling, and so on. And here, design can help amplify these aspects. For example, creating visible and high-quality cycling infrastructures, or designing public spaces that make social interaction more evident. So what happens is that cycling, which may have been perceived as marginal, then becomes more visible, more legitimate, even more desirable. And therefore, this means that design helps amplify different types of values like health, like proximity, and social interaction, things that perhaps were always there, but not so explicitly articulated and recognized. The fourth role instead is provocation. where design can help shift attention to those that are typically marginalized or less considered in a system. For instance, again, with the car-centric example, there is a typical prioritization of certain types of users, like drivers, commuters, or people that own a private vehicle. But what about other types of users, like children, elderly, or and so on? Design here can provoke by centering on these other perspectives and therefore making those questions not just technical questions, but intimately political questions. And the final role is imagination. This is where many different scholars are arguing that design can help construct alternative futures. So in the example again of the 15-minute city, this is not just a concept as we know, it is an attempt to make a different way of living tangible. A city where daily needs are accessible within short distances, streets are not dominated by cars, and public spaces can be used in a different way. When these transformations are implemented, people can experience a different reality, even if they are implemented in smaller spaces or partially. For instance, the sound of the city changes, the rhythm of movement changes, the way people interact changes. Therefore, this means for that design may allow rehearsing a different type of future, not as an abstract idea, which people are often struggling to fully grasp and understand, but as something that can be lived, that can be tested, and therefore better grasped and negotiated, also for its deeper and longer term consequences. So if we look at these examples as a whole, we can see that design is not solving a mobility problem in this idea of the 15-minute city, but it is rather revealing patterns, it is challenging assumptions, making values visible, shifting attention, and constructing alternatives overall. In other words, it is rather shaping how the problem itself is understood. So what I have termed earlier, the problem setting approach. And this is exactly the shift that I've been trying to describe throughout this talk. One that doesn't solve problems, but actually asks meaningful questions. And of course, a reflection that is closely linked to this is what kind of responsibility does this give designers, as the fifth order is not only structural, it is also ethical and political. So overall, and to conclude, for me, this means that design is increasingly becoming about structuring power within systems. And even if often this power may be hidden, designers may have the possibility to make it visible, and here may lay their real differentiating value. But this requires us to be much more precise about what we design, what design does, how we design, and what responsibility this carries with it. So I have spent this entire talk in trying to articulate my perspective on this, and I hope that this has been useful to spark your own reflection. And with this, I would like to thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for a terrific presentation and talk. And it was really made me think of a lot of different things. And hopefully it looks in on the screen as many people have really enjoyed this. And I think it's definitely open for some Q&A and also some kind of open discussion. So if you please can be able to raise your hand if you have some kind of presentation. And will you please put down your presentation, maybe, Marcia, so we can
Sure.
see each
Yeah.
other in the presentation. I will try to take away your spotlight for everyone.
Yes, please. To see my
So
huge face on the screen is never nice.
yeah, perfect. So thank you. And you cannot the other can please put on your cameras if you would like to, so we can see each other. And please raise your hand if you have a question or a reflection to Marcia or to the group as a whole. And please don't be shy. I think you're sitting and just thinking about what you just heard. So who is first out? We have Gerolf, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I think it summed up a lot of topics we have been discussing earlier, so really thought-provoking. I was just wondering, how would you describe the designer? Because design seems to expand quite a lot, and I also think the practice seems to expand quite a lot. And I just wonder who remains. Is there a designer anymore, or is everyone a designer, or is there a special role for the designer, or what is your point of view on the designer as such?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this has been a long-standing question in the design discipline and profession for a very long time. To be honest, my position on this has been always quite straightforward. I believe that everyone could be a designer if we understand the design in a very specific way, more linked to the approach that behavioral science and behavioral psychology has developed, where they say that everyone is capable of looking at problems from a different perspective, solving them creatively, the so-called creative problem-solving approach that we all know so well. On the other hand, if we think about design from a professional perspective, in that case, I do no longer believe that everyone is a designer, even if they've never gone through specific types of training, acquisition of mindsets, approaches, and so on. And my position on this has always been that there is the need for exercising some specific types of reasoning logics that are specific to design as a profession in order to call themselves a designer.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for a good question and also a good answer. Perfect. Do we have anyone else who have some kind of question or reflection or want to spin onto this kind of topic of who is and who is not the designer? While waiting for people to raise their hands, maybe I can have a go for a reflection I was sitting and thinking about, and that I've been thinking about a lot and probably been discussing with a lot of you in this screen as well. And is what, as you say, Marcia, what is the new role for the designer? It's a role of more ethics and more kind of trying to change the society into something else and trying to visualize how it could look like. And that also means that you have to decide upon what is a good society for the future, because I mean that is quite a political question. And I guess that there are many different answers to that one. And how do you reflect on what is the designer's role in deciding that, and what is the role of the democratic society from a political science perspective, for example?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question that it would be nice to hear everyone's reflection on in this room in particular, because as I was trying to argue throughout the speech, I do not believe that designers should have that sort of power to decide what is the good future for everyone. And in this sense, design is never neutral because we all make choices, and we also make choices as professionals as well as people. Therefore, what I was trying to argue is that the role of designer should rather be to enable this dialogue and to let contestation even emerge, and to let the society and the people discuss and grasp better, perhaps, or have better tools, be better equipped at understanding what is the type of future that they would really like to see realized, and then together to make that decision. I'm never really a fan of the power being in the hands of a few, as it is, for instance, now actually happening when it comes to developing these AI systems, where not many different voices are heard, but only those few that have the technical skills and capabilities are called upon to have a say in how algorithms should simplify the reality around us, because that's essentially what we accept when we use the algorithms and enter the digital space. We accept the simplification of the reality that those developing and having a decision-making power in the system have performed.
Well, thank you very much. Is there someone who wants to have some kind of reflection or question? Please raise your hand. We can see a physical hand raised. And Anna, please.
let's see if this. Yes, I'm on my mobile and I don't have the app, so there's no button. Anyway, thank you very much for the presentation. I was actually connecting a bit to the question that was posed before. So, who is a designer? And of course, we maybe in different ways, but we all have experience like trying to find our allies or people that have share a similar mindset, even without having the title in some organizations. But if we look at like the 5 orders of design, and we look at like I work in a public sector institution in a government, so I cannot help but looking at them also in a sort of hierarchical way. So the people that decide the policies are not the people that deliver the work or the service to the public. How would you see it working in such a space in order to guarantee that sort of continuity between what is the designerly contribution, let's say, on the 5th order, and how that trickles down or trickles in all the other levels? Like because yeah, I'm talking also maybe from like a personal perspective of being like, let's say I work in level 3. I am inspired by the 5th order, but I'm actually in the 3rd one, and then I have people working in the 1st one that I need to ensure they know what the thinking process was. So have you had any experience with that, in how to guarantee that coherence between all of these things that, to your point, don't really are not very tangible? So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the reflection. I think it is an interesting one, and I don't know that I have a good recipe to address that, because I believe that all organizations work in different ways, and in particular when organizations are very big, they're also very complex and sometimes fragmented, and therefore this continuity that you mentioned and maintaining a good, it's like even just communication or flow of information between different responsibilities, different departments can be very tricky, can be very difficult. We experience that. I experience that every day in my job, because Politecnico di Milano is a very big public organization where everyone works on a different level, and sometimes also here communication doesn't really flow and information are not distributed appropriately, but also not only information is undistributed, there is a huge cognitive overload from all of the different functions that you even struggle to keep up with all the things. So also here, I wouldn't say that I have a good recipe for addressing that. I think it's a matter of working on on the level of the organization, how the process is structured, and making sure that there is a constant effort dedicated to keeping everyone in the loop. But yeah, I don't know that this answers your questions, because essentially this is a problem that we are grappling with every day here. And I don't think that we solved it, to be quite honest.